April 23rd, 1917. Northern France. 3 wooden crosses stood in the mud outside the hangar. Fresh earth, new graves. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but water still dripped from the canvas roof, each drop marking time like a clock counting down. Lieutenant Edward Hartley stood 15 feet from those crosses, close enough to read the names carved into the wood. 3 pilots, 3 friends, dead in 48 hours. The youngest was 17, the oldest, 23. Eddie was 19 years old. He had 14 hours of flying time in his logbook. According to the statistics being whispered through every mess hall from Dover to Arras, he had 3.5 hours left to live. The average life expectancy of a British pilot in April 1917 was 17.5 flying hours. Not days, not weeks, hours. Some men died on their first combat mission. Others lasted a week, maybe 2. The truly lucky ones, the survivors, accumulated scars and nightmares and a 1,000-yard stare that made them look 40 by their 25th birthday. Eddie's hands shook as he pulled his gloves tighter. The shaking never stopped anymore. It started the day he arrived in France 3 weeks ago, fresh from a training program that had been cut from 8 weeks to 4 because the Royal Flying Corps was being slaughtered faster than Britain could replace them. Behind him, mechanics worked on a line of WWII reconnaissance aircraft. Slow machines, clumsy. The Germans called them Fokker fodder. Easy kills. Eddie had flown combat missions in a WWII once. 3 days ago, he had seen what happened when a German Albatross caught you at altitude with nowhere to hide. The morning briefing started in 20 minutes. Another patrol, another mission over German lines where fighters with twin machine guns and experienced killers at the controls waited like wolves. Eddie turned away from the graves and walked toward the briefing hut. His boots squelched in the mud. Artillery rumbled somewhere to the east, a constant background noise that never quite stopped. You learned to sleep through it, or you didn't sleep at all. Inside the hut, 18 pilots sat on wooden benches. 18 men in a squadron designed for 24. The math was simple and brutal. In the last month, they had lost 11 pilots. 5 replacements had arrived. 6 were already dead. Flight Sergeant Arthur Brennan sat near the back cleaning his goggles with a piece of cloth. 28 years old, from Dublin. A veteran by the standards of 1917, which meant he had survived 9 weeks of combat. His face carried the marks of a man who had seen too much and expected to see worse. Their eyes met. Artie nodded once. Eddie took the empty seat beside him. The briefing officer entered, a major with gray at his temples and a pronounced limp from a crash landing in 1916. He unrolled a map on the table at the front of the room. Gentlemen, artillery spotting mission over Arras. Observer crews will photograph German positions and radio coordinates to our batteries. Fighter escort will maintain position at 8,000 feet. Expect heavy enemy presence. Josta 11 has been active in this sector for the past week. The room went quiet. Josta 11. Everyone knew that squadron. Everyone feared it. Commanded by a 24-year-old cavalry officer named Manfred von Richthofen. The newspapers called him the Red Baron. The pilots called him Death. Under Richthofen's leadership, Josta 11 had claimed over a third of all British losses in April. Some reports said more. 5 aircraft shot down in succession. 6. The German pilots hunted in packs, diving from the sun, attacking with precision and ruthlessness that left wreckage scattered across the French countryside. Eddie's stomach twisted. His breakfast, what little he had managed to eat, threatened to come back up. The major continued speaking, assigning positions, outlining the mission timeline. Eddie heard the words, but they seemed distant, like they were being spoken underwater. His mind kept returning to those 3 crosses outside. Beside him, Artie leaned close and whispered, "First combat mission." Eddie's voice came out hoarse. "Second." "Right then, you're on Lewis gun duty with me today. If we see Germans, you shoot. Don't think about it. Don't try to be fancy. Just put rounds down range. Sometimes the noise alone makes them break off. And if it doesn't," Artie's expression didn't change, "then I fly like hell and you pray to whatever God you still believe in." The BE-2 sat on the grass canvas wings, trembling in the morning wind. Eddie performed his walk-around check, looking for tears in the fabric, checking the control cables, making sure nothing vital had worked itself loose. The Lewis gun, mounted on a rotating ring behind the pilot's seat, gleamed dully in the gray light. Artie climbed into the front cockpit. Eddie settled into the rear position, strapping himself in with leather belts that felt far too thin to hold a man if the aircraft went inverted, which it could, which it would if a German fighter got a good burst into the control surfaces. The mechanic spun the propeller. The engine cough caught, roared to life. Smoke and the smell of castor oil filled the air. The whole aircraft shook and rattled like it was trying to tear itself apart on the ground. Artie raised his hand. The mechanic pulled the chocks. The BE-2 began to roll, picking up speed, tail lifting, and then they were airborne, climbing slowly into a sky filled with scattered clouds and the distant black smudges of artillery bursts. 6 aircraft formed up in loose formation. 3 BE-2 reconnaissance machines and 3 Sopwith pups for fighter cover. The pups were better than the BE-2, more maneuverable with a single Vickers gun, but they were still outmatched by the newer German fighters in speed and firepower. They turned east toward the German lines. For the first 20 minutes, it was almost peaceful. Rolling farmland below, patchworked with shell craters and the zigzag scars of trenches. The morning sun broke through clouds, painting the world gold in shadow. If you didn't look too closely, if you ignored the devastation, it could have been beautiful. Eddie kept his eyes moving, scanning above, behind. The Lewis gun rotated smoothly on its mount. His fingers rested on the grips, not quite touching the trigger. Every muscle in his body was tense, waiting for the moment he knew was coming. The moment when death arrived. It came at 8,000 feet, 3 miles behind German lines. Artie's arms shot up, pointing. 6 o'clock high. Eddie twisted in his seat, looking up and back. 5 aircraft diving from the sun. Albatross D, 3 fighters. The sunlight glinted off their propellers. Twin machine guns mounted on the nose of each aircraft. Experienced pilots who had killed dozens of British airmen and would kill dozens more before this war ended if they lived that long. Josta 11. Eddie swung the Lewis gun, trying to track the lead fighter. The Albatross came in fast, faster than anything Eddie had experienced in training. 125 miles per hour in a dive. The BE-2's top speed was 90. He pulled the trigger. The gun made a sound. Click, 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 nothing. Jammed. Eddie's blood turned to ice. His hands moved frantically, trying to clear the jam, but his fingers were numb and clumsy. The Albatross grew larger in his vision, twin streams of tracer rounds walking toward them like bright fingers reaching out. Artie threw the BE-2 into a dive so steep Eddie's stomach lurched into his throat. The horizon disappeared. The earth filled his vision, brown and green and rushing up fast. Tracer rounds snapped past. So close, Eddie could hear them, a sound like fabric tearing. One bullet punched through the canvas 6 inches from his head. Another severed a control cable with a metallic twang. The Albatross stayed with them. The German pilot was good, very good, keeping them in his sights, even as the BE-2 dove at an angle that should have torn the wings off. More bullets, a steady stream. Eddie heard them hitting the aircraft. Thud, thud, ping. The smell of gasoline filled the air. The fuel tank had been hit. They were going to die. Right here, right now. Eddie's mind went perfectly clear and absolutely blank at the same time. He was 19 years old and he was about to burn alive in a canvas and wood coffin over France, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Artie pulled up at 500 feet. The wings groaned, the damaged control cables held by what seemed like luck and prayer. The Albatross, low on ammunition, or unwilling to follow them into the ground clutter, pulled up and climbed away. They were alive. Eddie couldn't breathe. His chest felt like it was being crushed. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. The world spun, and he couldn't tell if it was the aircraft or his own mind breaking. Artie flew them home. The engine coughed and sputtered. Fuel streamed from the damaged tank, leaving a thin trail in the air. The controls responded sluggishly. But they flew. 20 minutes that felt like hours. 20 minutes of waiting for the engine to quit, for the Germans to come back and finish what they started, for something vital to fail and send them tumbling into the earth. The aerodrome appeared ahead. Artie lined up for landing. The approach was too fast, too steep, but they hit the grass and rolled to a stop, and they were down. Eddie tried to climb out of the cockpit. His legs wouldn't work. They were jelly useless. Artie had to help him, half carrying him away from the aircraft before Eddie's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the wet grass. He vomited. Everything in his stomach came up in violent heaves. When there was nothing left, he dry heaved, his whole body shaking. Artie lit a cigarette and stood there smoking, waiting, not judging, just waiting. When Eddie could finally speak, his voice was barely a whisper. Does it get easier? Artie took a long drag from his cigarette. No, you just learned to function anyway. Later, the mechanics counted the bullet holes. 47. The fuel tank had 3 holes straight through it. One control cable was severed, held together by a single strand of wire. The rudder had a hole the size of a fist. That night, Eddie couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw tracer rounds, heard the sound of bullets punching through canvas, felt the certainty of death. 3 more pilots didn't come back from the afternoon patrol. 2 were listed as missing. 1 crashed behind British lines. His aircraft had been so badly shot up they couldn't tell what killed him, the bullets or the impact. The wooden crosses outside the hangar now numbered 6. June 3rd, 1917. The train arrived just after dawn carrying 6 wooden crates, each the size of a small automobile. The crates were unloaded onto wagons and hauled to the aerodrome under armed guard. Every pilot not on duty gathered to watch as the crates were pried open with crowbars. Inside, wrapped in canvas and smelling of fresh varnish and oil, were 6 Sopwith Camel fighters. Eddie stood with the crowd of pilots watching as mechanics carefully removed the packing material. The aircraft didn't look revolutionary, wood and canvas and wire like everything else flying in 1917, but details set it apart. Twin Vickers machine guns mounted directly in front of the cockpit. 2 guns, 800 rounds per minute combined. Twice the firepower of any fighter the RFC currently had in service. The breeches were covered with a distinctive humped metal fairing designed to prevent the guns from freezing at altitude. That hump gave the aircraft its nickname, the Camel. Someone in the crowd whistled, "Look at those guns. Finally we can fight back proper." Someone else touched the engine cowling with reverence. 110 horsepower rotary. We'll run circles around those albatross bastards. The squadron engineering officer climbed onto a crate and raised his voice. Gentlemen, a word of caution. This aircraft is unlike anything you've flown. The engine, fuel tank, guns, and pilot are all located in the forward 7 feet. This concentration of weight makes the Camel extremely maneuverable. It will outturn any fighter currently in service. However, he paused, making sure everyone was listening. This same characteristic makes the aircraft inherently unstable. It requires constant attention. The rotary engine creates significant gyroscopic forces. Right turns will be very tight. Left turns will be sluggish. The aircraft will stall and spin with very little warning. We have already lost pilots in training to exactly this issue. The crowd went quiet. Eddie moved closer, studying the aircraft. His father was a railway engineer. Eddie had grown up around machinery, learning to see the logic in how things worked. He could read an aircraft the way some men read books. The Camel sat nose down on its tail wheel like it was eager to tip forward. The propeller seemed oversized. Everything heavy in the front, everything light in the back. It looked unbalanced because it was unbalanced. Beside Eddie, a young pilot named Oliver Pemberton grinned with excitement. 20 years old, Eton-educated, brilliant mind. They had gone through training together, had become friends despite their different backgrounds. This is it, Eddie, finally. An aircraft that can match the Germans. We'll finally have a fighting chance. Eddie couldn't shake his unease. It looks unstable, like it wants to nose over. Oliver laughed. That's what makes it maneuverable. The designers know what they're doing. British engineering at its finest. Eddie said nothing. He had seen too much British engineering fail. Guns that jammed, engines that quit, control cables that snapped. Sometimes the designers got it wrong. Sometimes the machinery killed you. The squadron commander, a major with 2 years of combat experience and the ribbons to prove it, walked to the nearest Camel. Mechanics helped him into the cockpit. The rotary engine fired, cough, settled into a rattling roar that was noticeably different from the inline engines Eddie was used to. The Camel taxied to the grass strip. The tail lifted. The aircraft accelerated and lifted off smoothly. It climbed at what seemed like an impossible angle, gaining altitude faster than any aircraft Eddie had seen. At 3,000 feet, the commander began demonstration maneuvers. A right turn. The Camel snapped around so violently it looked like a toy being swung on a string. 45 degrees of bank in less than a second. a complete 180-degree reversal in under 3 seconds. Murmurs of approval from the watching pilots. A left turn, noticeably slower. The nose wanted to rise. The commander had to fight it, pushing forward on the stick to keep the nose down. Then came the demonstration that changed everything. At 2,000 feet, the commander pulled the nose up too aggressively. The Camel slowed, stalled, and then it didn't just stall. It snapped violently to the left and entered a spin so fast it seemed to defy physics. The aircraft rotated. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. Men on the ground started shouting. Someone swore. Eddie held his breath. At 800 feet, the commander recovered. The spin stopped. The nose came through the horizon. The Camel leveled out and climbed away. The landing was rough. When the commander climbed out of the cockpit, his face was pale beneath his tan. He gathered the pilots around him. Gentlemen, listen very carefully. This aircraft will kill you if you are careless. It will kill you if you are overconfident. It will kill you if you forget even for 1 second that it does not forgive mistakes. He paused, letting that sink in. But if you master it, if you learn its temperament and respect its power, you will own the sky. The choice is yours. A wooden cross, a red cross, or the Victoria Cross. That night, word came down through channels. In the past month, 17 Sopwith Camel pilots had died in training accidents. Not combat, training. The aircraft meant to save the Royal Flying Corps was killing British pilots faster than the Germans. Eddie lay in his tent listening to the distant artillery, thinking about 3 choices: death, injury, glory. He thought about Oliver's excitement, about Artie's quiet competence, about those crosses outside the hangar that kept multiplying. Somewhere out there, German pilots were sleeping in their own tents, maintaining their own aircraft, burying their own dead. The war ground on, men died, and the machines that were supposed to save them sometimes became their executioners. Eddie closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Tomorrow they would begin training on the Camel. Tomorrow someone would probably die. He just hoped it wouldn't be him. June 7th, 1917. Oliver Pemberton drew the first solo flight in a Sopwith Camel. He walked to the aircraft at dawn with a confidence that Eddie both envied and feared. Oliver had always been that way. Top marks at Eton, natural athlete, the kind of person who believed that intelligence and preparation could overcome any challenge. Eddie helped him with the cockpit straps, checking twice that everything was secure. Remember what the commander said: gentle inputs. The Camel responds to everything. Oliver smiled. I've read the manual 3 times, Eddie, every word. I know this aircraft inside and out. Knowing and doing are different things. I'll be fine. 20 minutes and I'll be back down. First pint's on me tonight. They shook hands. Eddie stepped back. The mechanic spun the propeller and the rotary engine caught with its distinctive bark and rattle. Oliver gave a thumbs up. The Camel began to roll. Takeoff was textbook perfect. Tail up at the right speed, lift at 55 miles per hour. A smooth, steady climb to pattern altitude at 800 feet. Oliver flew the downwind leg, turn crosswind, everything by the book. Then came the turn to final approach. A simple left turn, 90 degrees, something every pilot had done hundreds of times. Oliver pulled back on the stick. Just a fraction too much. Half an inch of movement. The Camel's nose rose, the aircraft slowed. And at 800 feet above the ground, with no altitude to spare for recovery, the Camel stalled. It didn't stall like the aircraft Eddie had trained on. Those would mush sink, give you time to recognize the problem and push the nose down. The Camel snapped inverted so fast, it looked like something had exploded. 1 second it was flying, the next it was spinning nose down, rotating like a leaf falling from a tree. Oliver had maybe 3 seconds to react. 3 seconds to recognize what was happening, to remember the recovery procedure, to execute the correct inputs. The Camel hit the ground at 90 miles per hour. The impact drove the engine back into the cockpit. The fuel tank ruptured. Fire bloomed orange and black against the morning grass. Eddie was running before he knew he was moving. His boots pounded the earth. Other men ran with him, but he was faster, driven by something beyond thought. He reached the wreckage 30 seconds after impact. The heat from the flames pushed him back. The smell of burning canvas and gasoline and something worse, something organic, filled his nose and throat. Through the smoke and fire, he could see the outline of Oliver's body still strapped in the cockpit. Not moving, never moving again. Men grabbed Eddie, pulled him back. He fought them, screaming Oliver's name. His voice broke. Tears streamed down his face. He kept screaming until his throat was raw and his voice was gone. They buried Oliver that afternoon. A simple wooden cross with his name, rank, and dates. Born 1897, died 1917, 20 years old. A waste. A goddamn waste. Eddie stood at the funeral with one thought burning in his mind like acid. The Camel killed Oliver. Not the Germans, not the war. A British aircraft with a British design flaw that British engineers knew about but couldn't or wouldn't fix. 18 pilots had now died in Camel training accidents, 18 crosses, 18 families receiving telegrams. That night, Lieutenant Colonel Lestrange of the Central Flying School would write in his official report, "Camels continually spin down out of control when flown by pupils on their first solos. We are losing men at an unacceptable rate." His solution was to remove the main fuel tank from training aircraft and install smaller ones allowing for dual controls. It would help. Some time, but the Camel would never be safe. It would always demand absolute attention, perfect technique, unflinching focus. Eddie sat alone in the mess hall staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Around him, other pilots talked quietly or didn't talk at all. Everyone had known Oliver. Everyone had liked him. Artie sat down across from Eddie. He didn't say anything, just sat there smoking a cigarette, waiting. Finally, Eddie spoke. "I could request a transfer, bombers, reconnaissance, anything but this." "You could. Nobody would blame me." "Probably not." Eddie looked up, meeting Artie's eyes. "But you would." Artie stubbed out his cigarette. "I'd understand, but yes, I'd think you quit when it got hard. And Eddie, everything gets hard eventually. Every aircraft, every mission, every damn day of this war. So what do I do? You make a choice, walk away, or master the thing that killed your friend. There's no shame in either, but there's no middle ground. The Camel doesn't accept half measures." Eddie sat in silence for a long time. Outside, mechanics worked through the night preparing aircraft for tomorrow's missions. The war didn't stop for grief. The war didn't stop for anything. He thought about Oliver's confidence, about the manual he had read 3 times, about knowledge versus instinct, theory versus practice, and he made his choice. "I want to learn it properly, really learn it, not just the manual, the aircraft itself, how it thinks, how it reacts, everything." Artie nodded slowly. "Then we start tomorrow. Dual controls. We'll fly until you can do it in your sleep, until the Camel is an extension of your hands, until you and that machine understand each other. How long will that take? However long it takes. Some men never get there. Some get it in a week. But Eddie, if you're going to do this, commit, all in, because the Camel can tell when you're afraid. It can feel hesitation, and it will kill you for it." Eddie looked at the cold tea in his cup. He thought about wooden crosses and red crosses and Victoria crosses. 3 choices. Only one led forward. "All in high," he said quietly. Artie almost smiled. "Good. Get some sleep. We start at dawn. And Eddie, this is going to be the hardest thing you have ever done." Eddie believed him. For 3 days after Oliver's funeral, Eddie couldn't bring himself to approach the Camel flight line. He flew reconnaissance missions in the old BE-2, the aircraft he knew, the aircraft that wouldn't betray him with a moment's inattention. Safe, predictable, slow. On the 4th day, he found himself standing in the hangar at midnight, staring at a Sopwith Camel by lamplight. The aircraft sat silent shadows playing across its fabric skin. It looked predatory even when motionless. Nose down, tail up, coiled like something waiting to strike. A voice came from the darkness behind the aircraft. "Can't sleep either, eh?" Eddie startled. A man emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. Danny Wright, 35 years old, Cockney accent thick as London fog, chief mechanic for the Camel flight, 20 years working on engines from factory floors to race cars to the rotary monsters that powered these killing machines. "Just thinking," Eddie said. Danny grunted. He moved to the Camel's engine, running his hand along the cooling fins with the familiarity of a man greeting an old friend. Or an old enemy. Thinking about young Pemberton, I expect. Good lad, smart. Too smart, maybe. He read the manual 3 times. I know. He told me. Danny lit a cigarette, the match flare illuminating a face weathered by years and hard work. Manuals are written by men who understand theory. But this beast, he patted the engine cowling. This runs on physics. And physics don't care how many times you read about it. Eddie stepped closer. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Understanding how something works means understanding why it fails. Every machine has a logic. Find the logic, master the machine. Can I ask you something? Danny exhaled smoke. If it's whether this thing is safe, answers no. Never will be. That's not what I need to know. Danny looked at him properly for the first time. What then? Eddie chose his words carefully. Can it be understood the way it behaves? Is there logic to it, or is it just chaos? Something shifted in Danny's expression. He took a long drag from his cigarette, studying Eddie like he was reassessing something. Your da was an engineer, weren't he? Railway engineer, Manchester. Figured. You got that look. The one that sees past the canvas and wood to what makes it work. Danny moved to the propeller, gripping one blade. Come here, let me show you something. Eddie approached. Danny gestured to the engine. This is a Clerget 9B rotary, 110 horsepower, 9 cylinders arranged in a circle. But here's what makes it different from every other engine you have seen. The entire engine rotates. Crankshaft stays fixed. Engine spins around it. 1,200 revolutions per minute. He let that sink in. Now you take 400 pounds of metal spinning at 1,200 RP, and what do you get? A gyroscope, Eddie said quietly. Exactly. A bloody great gyroscope bolted to the front of your aircraft. And gyroscopes, well, they got rules. Physics, Newton's laws, action and reaction. Danny held up his cigarette, using it to illustrate. Turn right, the gyroscope helps you. All that rotating mass wants to tip the nose down and roll you right. Makes for tight turns. Very tight. Turn left. He rotated his hand the opposite direction. Now you're fighting it. Gyroscope resists. Nose wants to come up. Turn gets sluggish. Eddie's mind raced, connecting pieces. And if you pull back too hard in a left turn, you stall because you're fighting all that rotational force and bleeding off speed trying to overcome it. Aircraft stalls, nose drops, and you got maybe 3 seconds before you're in a spin. But right turns, you got all that force working with you. Snap roll, 2 seconds from level to 90 degrees. Use it right, you can outmaneuver anything the Germans got. Eddie stared at the engine with new understanding. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't trying to kill pilots. It was just following physical laws, immutable and predictable. If you understood the laws, you could work with them. So the trick is, Danny interrupted, stop fighting it. Learn what it wants to do naturally and use that. Right turns tight and aggressive. Left turns wide and gentle. Keep your speed up. Never get slow and nose high in a left turn. And for God's sake, respect the stall. Eddie felt something unlock in his mind. A shift from fear to comprehension. From seeing the camel as an enemy to seeing it as a tool. A dangerous tool, yes. Unforgiving, but logical. Can you teach me? Eddie asked. Not just to fly it, to understand it. Really understand it. Danny studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Tomorrow morning, 0500. Bring a notebook. We start with weight and balance, then move to control forces, then gyroscopic precession. You're going to learn this aircraft from the inside out. Every wire, every control surface, every quirk. And when you can tell me why it does what it does, then we put you in the cockpit. Flight Sergeant Brennan is supposed to start dual control training with me tomorrow. I know, I already talked to him. He agrees, you need theory before practice, foundation before building. Danny ground out his cigarette. Most pilots try to muscle this thing into submission. That's why they die. You're going to learn to work with it. Make it your partner, not your opponent. Eddie nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, lad. This is going to be harder than anything you've done. I'm going to make you calculate stall speeds, gyroscopic forces, control surface deflections. You're going to understand this machine better than the men who designed it. And only then, when you can predict what it'll do before it does, it will I let you fly it solo. How long will that take? Danny almost smiled. However long it takes. The next 2 weeks became the most intensive education of Eddie's life. Every morning at 5, he met Danny in the hangar. They started with basics. Weight distribution, center of gravity. The Camel carried 400 pounds of engine, 180 pounds of fuel when full, 30 pounds of ammunition, 40 pounds of guns, and 160 pounds of pilot. All in the front 7 feet of a 20-foot aircraft. Eddie filled notebooks with calculations, drew diagrams, learned that the center of gravity sat 24 inches ahead of the wing's aerodynamic center, which meant the aircraft constantly wanted to nose down. Every second in flight, you pulled back on the stick just to maintain level flight. Your arm would cramp, your shoulder would burn, but relax for an instant and the nose would drop. Danny made him calculate stall speeds at different weights, different altitudes, different bank angles. Made him understand that a 60-degree bank turn doubled the stall speed, that pulling back hard in a turn could stall you at 90 miles per hour when your straight and level stall speed was 55. Physics don't care about your rank or how brave you are, Danny would say. You exceed critical angle of attack, you stall. Every time. No exceptions. In the afternoons, Eddie flew with Artie in a modified Camel with dual controls. The first flights were humbling. Everything happened faster than Eddie expected. The Camel wanted to turn right even when he tried to fly straight. The stick forces were heavy, constant, demanding. His arm ached after 20 minutes. But slowly understanding became instinct. He learned to feel the aircraft through his hands and feet. The stick pressure told him airspeed. The rudder pressure told him coordination. The vibration through the seat told him when he was approaching a stall. Artie taught him the art of it. The science was Danny's domain, but Artie understood the intuition required to survive. Stop thinking, Artie would shout over the engine noise. Feel it. The Camel talks to you if you listen. That buffet in the stick. That's it, saying slow down. That lightness in the elevator. Approaching stall. Your body knows before your mind does. Trust it. They practiced stalls at altitude. Eddie learned that the Camel gave you about half a second of warning. A slight buffet in the controls. Then the nose would drop, and if you weren't perfectly coordinated, one wing would drop and you'd be in a spin before you could process what happened. Recovery required precision. Stick forward to break the stall. Full opposite rudder to stop rotation. Wait for the spin to stop. Neutral controls. Gentle pull-out. Rush any step and you'd either stay in the spin or rip the wings off pulling out. After 10 days, Eddie had 40 hours in the Camel, more than any other pilot in the squadron. More dual instruction than the training pipeline normally allowed. But the pipeline was killing pilots, and Artie and Danny had decided Eddie would be different. On June 26th, Artie climbed out of the front cockpit after a training flight and looked at Eddie. Tomorrow, first solo. Eddie's stomach clenched. You think I'm ready? I think if I don't sign you off now, you'll overthink it and talk yourself out of what you already know. You understand this aircraft better than men with 100 hours. Time to prove it. That night, Eddie couldn't sleep. He reviewed everything in his mind. Takeoff procedures, climb speeds, turn entries, stall recovery, emergency procedures. The knowledge was there, but knowledge and execution were different things. He thought about Oliver, about confidence without caution, about believing the manual instead of respecting the machine. He thought about those 3 choices: Wooden Cross, Red Cross, Victoria Cross. Tomorrow he would discover which one fate had chosen for him. Dawn came cold and clear. Eddie walked to the flight line with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Camel B3782 sat waiting, morning dew glistening on his fabric skin. Danny had spent the previous evening going over every inch of it. The aircraft was as perfect as human hands could make it. Danny met him at the aircraft. She's ready. Question is, are you? I don't know. Good answer. Confidence kills. Respect keeps you alive. Danny tapped the engine, cowling. Remember what I taught you. This is physics. Predictable. Use it, don't fight it. And Eddie, yeah, come back. Artie stood by the wingtip smoking. He said nothing, just nodded once. Eddie climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, checked controls, fuel, mixture, throttle, everything mechanical, automatic. His hands knew what to do even if his mind was screaming. The mechanic swung the propeller. The clerget caught with its distinctive rough bark. The entire aircraft vibrated. Eddie could feel that 400-pound engine spinning, could sense the gyroscopic forces even at idle power. He waved away the chocks. The Camel began to roll, tail up at 40 miles per hour. The stick pressure changed, becoming lighter. He compensated, feeling the aircraft's mood through his hands. At 55 miles per hour, he eased back and the Camel lifted off. Immediate right turn tendency. Eddie caught it with left rudder coordinated climb straight ahead. At 500 feet, he began a gentle right turn to stay in the pattern. The Camel snapped into the turn eagerly. Eddie rolled out smoothly. At 5,000 feet, he began the real test. Level flight, trim. He let go of the stick briefly. The nose dropped immediately. He caught it. That forward center of gravity, always trying to tip the aircraft into a dive. Constant back pressure required. His arm would learn, would adapt. Gentle left turn. He felt the nose want to rise. Forward pressure. Right rudder. The turn was slower than he wanted but coordinated. He rolled out on heading. Now the dangerous one. Right turn. He banked the aircraft, felt the gyroscopic force grab hold. The Camel rolled violently right, nose dropping, the whole machine pivoting like it was hinged on a pin. Eddie's heart hammered, but his hand stayed smooth. Roll out, level, perfect. Climbing turn to the right. The Camel corkscrewed upward, gaining 500 feet in one rotation. Eddie laughed out loud. This was what they meant. This was the advantage. No German aircraft could follow this. At 8,000 feet, Eddie's hands moved before his conscious mind decided. He pulled the nose up, reduced power, felt the aircraft slow. The buffet started, gentle at first, then stronger. The stall happened exactly as Danny had predicted. The nose dropped. Eddie caught it immediately. Stick forward, full right rudder. The incipient spin stopped before it started. Recovery, clean, controlled. He tried it again. This time let the spin develop. One rotation, two. His stomach lurched, but his hand stayed steady. Recovery inputs. The spin stopped. Nose down, power on. Pull out. Altitude lost 1,500 feet. Eddie climbed back to altitude, mind racing with understanding. The Camel wasn't evil. It was honest. It told you immediately when you made a mistake. There was no forgiveness, but there was fairness. Follow the rules and it worked with you. Break the rules and it would kill you without hesitation or mercy. He spent 30 minutes practicing. Steep turns, slow flight, stalls, each maneuver teaching him something new about the aircraft's personality. By the time he entered the pattern for landing, his arm ached from constant back pressure, but his mind was clear. Final approach. Power back. Speed 80 miles per hour, bleeding to 70. Over the threshold at 65. Flare. Hold it off. The Camel wanted to drop, but Eddie held back pressure. The wheels kissed grass so gently he barely felt it. Tail down, roll out, stop. Eddie sat in the cockpit after shutdown, hands shaking, but not from fear. From adrenaline, from joy, from the pure exhilaration of having danced with something deadly and come away alive. Artie and Danny walked to the aircraft together. Neither man smiled, but Eddie could see it in their eyes. Well, Eddie asked. Artie pulled out a cigarette. You'll do. Danny patted the engine, cowling. Told you. Physics. You understand physics, you understand this. That afternoon, Eddie was promoted to flight lieutenant. The next morning, orders came through. The squadron was moving to Belgium, to the front lines at Ypres, where Jasta 11 and the Red Baron hunted. Eddie Hartley had mastered the Camel. Now he would discover if that was enough to keep him alive. The aerodrome near Ypres sat 3 miles behind the front lines, close enough to hear artillery constantly, close enough to smell the mud and death that characterized the Western Front in summer 1917. Eddie's first combat patrol in a Camel launched on July 3rd, 6 aircraft in loose formation. Eddie flew as wingman to Artie, his position the same as always, but the aircraft underneath him completely different. The Camel felt alive in a way the BE-2 never had. Responsive. Eager. Every control input produced immediate results. Eddie had to constantly remind himself to be gentle, to not over-control. They climbed to 12,000 feet and turned east, crossing into German-held territory. The landscape below was a moonscape of craters and destroyed villages. Nothing green, nothing living, just mud and wire and the geometric scars of trenches stretching to the horizon. 20 minutes into the patrol, Artie's hand shot up. Contact. 6 o'clock high. Eddie's heart rate spiked instantly, but his hand stayed steady. He craned his neck, searching. There. 4 aircraft diving from altitude. Albatros DFA, the newest German fighter. Faster than the D3. Better climb rate. Deadlier. But not as maneuverable as the Camel. The lead Albatross selected Artie as his target, diving in with the sun behind him. Eddie reacted on instinct and training. Hard right turn. The Camel snapped around tighter than the German expected. In 2 seconds, Eddie had reversed position, putting himself behind and to the side of the diving Albatross. The German pilot saw him, tried to brake left. Too late. Eddie pressed the trigger. Both Vickers guns hammered. 800 rounds per minute. Tracer every fifth round, bright streams reaching out. Eddie walked the charters toward the Albatross, compensating for deflection, for relative motion for the wind. Most rounds missed. That was normal. Deflection shooting at high speed was nearly impossible. But some rounds hit. Eddie saw fabric tear on the Albatross's left wing, saw wood splinter. The German dove away, trailing smoke. Eddie tried to follow, but lost sight in the clouds. No confirmed kill, no witness. But Artie had seen him shoot, seen him maneuver, seen him use the Camel's strengths exactly as taught. When they landed, Artie gripped Eddie's shoulder. That was good flying. Real combat is different from training. You held it together. Eddie's hands were shaking again. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion. He had fired his guns at another human being, had tried to kill a man he'd never met. The Albatross pilot was probably 20 years old, just like Eddie. Probably had a family, friends, dreams. War reduced all of that to brief moments of violence, where the only question was, who had better training, better luck, better position? Does it get easier? Eddie asked. The killing, Artie lit a cigarette. No, but you learn to live with it, or you don't. And if you don't, you die, because hesitation in a dogfight gets you killed. Over the next 2 weeks, Eddie flew 16 combat patrols. He encountered enemy aircraft 7 times. He got into firing position 3 times. He scored probable hits twice more, but no confirmed kills. Then on July 17th, everything changed. Evening patrol, 8 camels led by Captain Coleb, a New Zealander with 11 confirmed victories. The formation crossed into Belgium at 8,000 feet, golden light painting the clouds. Beautiful if you could ignore the war below. The radio crackled. Jasta 11 spotted. 7 aircraft, intercept course. Eddie's mouth went dry. Jasta 11. The Red Baron Squadron. The killers who had slaughtered British pilots throughout bloody April. But it was July now, and they were flying camels. The German formation appeared ahead, slightly below. 7 Albatros DV in tight formation. Professional, deadly. They had killed hundreds of Allied pilots. Captain Collet waggled his wings. TAC. The formations merged. 8 camels versus 7 Albatros. Chaos. Aircraft everywhere, turning diving guns, hammering. An Albatross climbed toward Eddie from below the pilot, trying to use his superior power to weight ratio to gain advantage. Eddie watched him come, let him commit, then rolled right and dove. The Camel's unique characteristics saved him. That gyroscopic force, that concentration of weight forward, made the dive instant and the turn brutal. The Albatross pilot, expecting a sustained climb fight, couldn't react fast enough. Eddie pulled out of the dive 500 feet below, reversed hard right again, and came up behind the Albatrosses as it tried to piano. 200 yards, 100, 50. Eddie squeezed both triggers. The Vickers guns roared. Sustained burst. 3 seconds. 4. The tracers converged on the Albatross's engine. Metal sparked. The propeller shattered. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The Albatross nosed over into a steepening dive, trailing fire. Eddie followed long enough to see it impact in a field behind German lines. Explosion. Fire. No parachute. His first confirmed kill. Eddie didn't feel triumph. Didn't feel joy. He felt sick. He had just ended a human life. Watched a man die. The Albatross pilot had probably woken up that morning, had breakfast, written a letter home. Now he was ash and torn metal. But there was no time for reflection. The dogfight continued around him. Eddie climbed back into the fight, searching for Artie. He found him engaged with two albatross, turning desperately trying to keep them from getting position. Eddie dove on the nearest one, fired a burst that missed, but forced the German to break off. The second albatross stayed with Artie. Eddie tried to close distance, but wasn't fast enough. He watched helpless as the German got a perfect deflection shot. Watched Artie's Camel stagger, smoke from the engine. Artie's hand came up, waved once. Eddie knew what that meant. I'm done. Get clear. Artie's Camel went down in a controlled descent, trailing smoke. Eddie followed, watching. The Camel landed hard in a field behind British lines, nosed over. Eddie circled. One saw Artie climb out of the wreckage. Alive. Injured, but alive. Eddie climbed back to altitude, fury burning in his chest. He found the albatross that had shot Artie. The German was celebrating, barrel rolling, not watching his 6 o'clock. Fatal mistake. Eddie closed to 30 yards before firing. Point-blank range. Both guns, sustained burst. The albatross disintegrated, wings folded, fuselage broke in half. The pieces tumbled toward Earth. Second confirmed kill. The fight ended. The remaining German aircraft fled. Final tally: 5 albatross destroyed, 1 damaged. 1 Camel damaged, pilot safe. 0 deaths. The exact opposite of Bloody April. When they landed, Eddie learned that Artie had 3 broken ribs and a concussion. He'd be grounded for 6 weeks, maybe longer. Eddie visited him in the field hospital that evening. Artie lay in bed, bandaged, pale, but alive. You got both of them, Artie said. I saw good shooting. You taught me everything I know. Not everything, the rest you learned yourself. Artie grimaced as he shifted position. Eddie, listen. The squadron needs experienced pilots. You're going to be asked to train the new men, the ones coming in with 10 hours and a prayer. I've only got 2 months of combat, and that's more than they'll have. You understand the Camel better than most pilots with 100 hours. Danny told me about the notebooks, the calculations, the study. Use that. Teach them what you know. Eddie thought about Oliver, about crosses in the mud, about young men dying because they didn't understand the machine they were flying. I don't want that responsibility. I know, but you're getting it anyway. That's what war does. Makes children into killers and killers into teachers. You think I wanted to be responsible for you? I didn't. But here we are. Eddie nodded slowly. When you're healed, you'll come back. Artie didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was different. Older. Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes the body heals, but the mind doesn't. I've seen too much, Eddie. Done too much. There's a limit to how much killing a man can do before he's not really a man anymore. You saved my life. Multiple times. And you saved mine today. We're even. Whatever happens next, remember that you survived because you learned. You didn't just fly the Camel. You understood it. That understanding is the difference between the Wooden Cross and the Victoria Cross. 3 days later, a fresh-faced pilot arrived, 18 years old, terrified, assigned to Eddie for training. Eddie looked at the boy and saw himself 4 months earlier, saw Oliver's confidence, saw the potential for another cross in the mud. He made a decision. This one would live. Whatever it took, whatever he had to teach this pilot would survive, would learn, would master the Camel the right way. Eddie Hartley, 19 years old, 2 confirmed kills, began his new role. Teacher, mentor, guardian of lives he hadn't yet saved. The war ground on. But in one small corner of it, one young pilot was changing the calculus. One student at a time. One life saved. One cross that wouldn't be planted in the mud. It wasn't much, but it was something. September 1917. Eddie stood in the briefing hut watching 3 new pilots trying not to look terrified. All 3 were 18 years old. All 3 had fewer than 20 flight hours. One had never fired a gun in the air. Another had never flown above 5,000 feet. The third had arrived from England that morning and still wore his training school insignia. This was what the Royal Flying Corps had become. Boys sent to die because there was nobody else. Eddie was 19. Ancient by the standards of 1917. A veteran, 2 confirmed kills, and 5 probables. 47 combat missions. More hours in a Camel than most pilots accumulated before they died. He had been asked to keep these boys alive. The responsibility sat on his shoulders like physical weight. Gentlemen, Eddie said, his voice steadier than he felt. The Sopwith Camel is the finest fighter aircraft in the world. It will outmaneuver anything the Germans have. It will give you every advantage in combat, but it will also kill you without hesitation if you disrespect it. The three pilots stared at him with wide eyes. Eddie continued, I'm going to teach you what I wish someone had taught me, not just how to fly it, how to survive it, how to make it your partner instead of your executioner. Over the next 3 weeks, Eddie drilled them relentlessly. He made them study weight and balance until they could calculate center of gravity in their sleep, made them understand gyroscopic precession, stall speeds, spin recovery. He took them up in dual-control aircraft and made them practice stalls at altitude until they could recover instinctively without thought. He taught them what Danny had taught him, that the Camel was physics made manifest, that it followed rules as immutable as gravity. Learn the rules and you could predict its behavior. Ignore the rules and you would die. One of the three washed out after a week, couldn't handle the stress, requested transfer to bombers. Eddie approved it without hesitation. Better to admit your limitations than die proving them. The other two progressed, slowly at first, then with growing confidence, tempered by healthy fear. Eddie watched them like a hawk, correcting mistakes before they became fatal, pushing them hard but never past their limits. After 4 weeks, both soloed successfully. Both survived their first combat missions. Both were still alive when Eddie's orders came through in November. Home defense rotation. England, London. Night fighters against German bombers. Eddie said goodbye to his students, shook their hands, saw in their eyes what he hoped was understanding. They had been given a gift. Knowledge, preparation. Time to learn before being thrown into the meat grinder. One of them would survive the war. The other would die in March 1918, shot down over Cambrai. But he would die as a pilot with 12 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills, not as a terrified boy on his first flight. It wasn't much, but it was something. The aerodrome at Manston sat on the Kent coast close enough to London that on clear nights you could see the city lights. November 1917 brought cold wind off the channel and news that German Gotha bombers were increasing their raids on the capital. The Camels assigned to home defense had been modified, navigation lights installed, the twin Vickers guns removed and replaced with a single overwing Lewis gun. The Lewis could fire incendiary ammunition rounds filled with phosphorus that burned at temperatures hot enough to ignite hydrogen, essential for engaging Zeppelins and the fabric-covered Gothas. Eddie's first night intercept came on November 20th. The alert sounded at 11 p.m. 15 Gotha bombers inbound. Eddie and 5 other pilots scrambled in darkness, engines roaring to life, exhaust spitting blue flames that ruined night vision. Taking off in darkness was an exercise in controlled terror. No horizon, no visual references, just the dim glow of navigation lights and the thundering engine, and your instruments telling you whether you were climbing or diving into the earth. Eddie climbed to 10,000 feet, guided by searchlights sweeping the sky. The ground controller vectored him toward the bomber stream. Eddie's eyes had adjusted to darkness, but visibility was still terrible. Clouds obscured the moon. The only light came from searchlights and the occasional flash of anti-aircraft fire. Then he saw it, a massive shape silhouetted against clouds. A Gotha G4 bomber. Wingspan 78 feet. 3 crew members. Payload of 1,000 pounds of high explosive destined for London's East End. Eddie climbed above and behind, approaching from the Gotha's blind spot. The bomber's defensive guns couldn't depress far enough to engage an aircraft attacking from directly below and behind. At 100 yards, Eddie opened fire with the Lewis gun. The incendiary rounds arced through darkness like falling stars. Most missed. Night shooting was even harder than day combat. No depth perception, no way to judge distance accurately. But some rounds hit. Eddie saw sparks where bullets struck metal, saw fabric tear on the port wing. The Gotha banked left trying to evade, but the big bomber was too slow, too ponderous. Eddie fired again. Longer burst. The Lewis gun hammered hot brass cascading past his face. More hits. The Gotha's port engine began trailing smoke. Then flame. Fire spread fast on fabric-covered aircraft. Within seconds, the entire port wing was ablaze bright orange against the black sky. The Gotha entered a spiral, falling crew members, abandoning ship with parachutes blossoming white. Eddie didn't follow it down, didn't watch it crash. Already he was scanning for the next target. He found two more Gothas that night, damaged one badly enough to force it to turn back. The other escaped into clouds before he could get into position. When dawn came and the surviving bombers limped back to Belgium, the tally was impressive. 3 Gothas destroyed in combat, 2 more by anti-aircraft fire, 1 crash due to engine failure. The heaviest losses German bombers had sustained in a single night over England. Eddie landed as the sun rose, exhausted hands cramping from hours of gripping the stick in cold air at altitude. He had flown 4 hours straight. His Camel had burned through 2 full fuel loads, landing to refuel and rearm before launching again. In the mess hall, other pilots talked excitedly about the victory. Eddie sat alone drinking tea, thinking about the 3 German crew members who had died on the Gotha he'd shot down. Young men, probably conscripts, doing their duty, now dead. War was supposed to get easier. The killing was supposed to become routine, but it never did. Each victory carried weight. Each death added to the burden. A pilot Eddie didn't recognize sat down across from him. Older than most, mid-20s, Canadian accent. "You're Hartley, right, the one who teaches the new pilots?" "Was, before rotation." "William Barker, just arrived from France. They're transitioning me to Camels from Sopwith pups." Eddie looked up. He knew that name. Barker was already an ace. 8 confirmed kills, decorated, respected. "What can I do for you?" Barker leaned forward. "I heard you understand the Camel better than most. The mechanics, the physics of it. I've got a week before I go back to France. I want to learn everything you know." Eddie studied him. Barker's eyes were steady, serious. This wasn't pride or arrogance. This was a professional seeking knowledge that might keep him alive. "All right, we start tomorrow. 0500, bring a notebook." Over the next week, Eddie shared everything Danny had taught him, everything he learned through experience. Barker absorbed it like a sponge, asking intelligent questions, making connections Eddie hadn't considered. On Barker's last day before returning to France, they flew together. Eddie demonstrated the tight right turns, the careful left turns, the way to use the Camel's instability as an advantage. When they landed, Barker shook his hand. "Thank you. You probably just saved my life several times over. Just passing along what was taught to me. That's how knowledge survives, one pilot to the next." Barker smiled slightly. "I'm going to fly a Camel-designated B6313. I have a feeling that aircraft and I are going to do good work together." Eddie would later learn that Barker and B6313 would achieve 46 confirmed victories together, the most successful fighter aircraft in the entire war. The lessons Eddie had shared would echo through dozens of combats, would save Barker's life repeatedly, would contribute to making him one of the war's greatest aces. Knowledge passed forward, lives saved, the invisible legacy of teachers who never received medals. June 1918. Eddie's squadron returned to France. 8 months had passed since he'd left. Everything had changed. The German spring offensive had pushed Allied lines back miles. Desperate fighting, massive casualties. The introduction of American troops was beginning to shift the balance, but the outcome was still uncertain. And in the air, a new threat had emerged. The Fokker D-7. Eddie first encountered one on June 15th, 3 days after returning to the front. A patrol at 15,000 feet. 6 Camels versus 4 Fokkers. The Fokker D-7 was everything the Albatross wasn't. Powerful engine, excellent climb rate, stable gun platform. And most critically, it performed well at high altitude, where the Camel struggled. Eddie watched in frustration as the Fokkers climbed away from his pursuing Camel. At 15,000 feet, the Clerget rotary engine was gasping for air. The Camel's climb rate had fallen to barely 200 feet per minute. The Fokkers climbed at twice that, maintaining position above choosing when and where to engage. The fight ended in a draw. Both sides broke off without losses. But Eddie understood immediately that the balance had shifted again. The Camel's dominance was over. At altitude, the new German fighters were superior. That reality was confirmed over the next month. The squadron lost 3 pilots to Fokker D-7 uprise. All 3 fights had the same pattern. Fokkers above using superior altitude performance to dictate the engagement. Camels below unable to climb high enough to engage effectively. The solution came in July. Orders from headquarters. Camel squadrons were being reassigned to ground attack. Low-level work, strafing trenches, attacking supply convoys, supporting infantry advances. Dangerous missions that negated the Fokker's altitude advantage but exposed pilots to intense ground fire. Eddie's Camel B-3782 was modified. Cooper bombs fitted under the fuselage. The overwing Lewis gun removed twin Vickers reinstalled. Maximum ammunition load. The first ground attack mission launched on July 23rd. 6 Camels. Target German supply depot 3 miles behind the lines. Attack altitude 500 feet. They came in low and fast, skimming over trenches, soldiers below looking up in surprise. Eddie saw German infantry diving for cover, saw anti-aircraft guns swiveling to track them. The supply depot appeared ahead. Trucks, ammunition crates, fuel drums, a target-rich environment, and Eddie pickled his bombs at 300 feet, pulled up hard as explosions bloomed behind him. Reverse came back for a strafing run. Both Vickers hammering, tracers tearing into vehicles, men equipment. Ground fire came up in streams. Rifles, machine guns, light anti-aircraft. The sky filled with bullets, and Eddie flew through it, felt her rounds hitting his aircraft, heard the snap and ping of metal on metal. His left wing took 3 hits. Fabric tore. A control cable severed. The Camel pulled hard left. Eddie compensated with right stick, right rudder, fighting to keep the aircraft stable. He made it back to base, landed with the damaged wing, the Camel trying to roll left the entire approach. When he climbed out, Danny counted 17 bullet holes. "You're lucky," Danny said, examining the severed cable. 6 inches to the right, and that would have hit the fuel tank. Eddie flew 4 more ground attack missions that week. Each one was a gauntlet of fire. Each one brought more damage to B-3782. Each time Danny patched and repaired, keeping the old Camel flying with skill and determination and an endless supply of prayers. By October, Eddie had 12 confirmed victories. Ace status. More importantly, he'd survived 13 months of combat, an eternity in 1918. But his luck was running out. He could feel it. Every pilot reached a point where the odds caught up, where skill and training weren't enough, where one bullet found its mark. October 28, 1918. Rumors of armistice negotiations had been circulating for weeks. Everyone knew the war was ending. The question was whether you'd survive long enough to see it. Eddie sat in the briefing hut listening to the mission outline. Ground attack. German supply convoy near Mons. 8 Camels. Low-level strike. He was assigned as flight leader. 12 kills. Veteran. The responsibility had shifted from being taught to teaching, from surviving to leading. The 8 pilots under his command were young. The oldest was 21. 2 were on their first combat mission. Eddie had trained both of them, drilled them relentlessly, taught them everything he knew. Now he would lead them into fire and see if his teaching had been enough. They took off at dawn. The weather was poor, low clouds, intermittent rain, visibility terrible. Perfect conditions for a low-level strike if you could navigate by landmarks and instinct. Eddie led them east at 500 feet, following roads and rail lines, using church steeples and rivers to maintain position. Navigation by map and compass, and the accumulated knowledge of dozens of missions over this scarred landscape. The convoy appeared ahead. 20 trucks. Infantry escort. Moving south on a dirt road through farmland. Eddie waggled his wings. Tack. The 8 Camels dove from 500 feet to 100. Eddie's bombs fell, first hitting the lead truck. Explosion. The convoy scattered. German soldiers leapt from vehicles, taking cover, bringing rifles and machine guns to bear. Ground fire erupted like a wall. Eddie flew through it, both Vickers firing tracers, tearing into trucks and men. Behind him, 7 other Camels followed, adding their firepower to the chaos. On the second pass, Eddie's engine coughed. The smooth roar became rough stuttering. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. A bullet had found something vital. Eddie pulled up, gaining altitude while he still had power. The engine quit completely at 800 feet. Dead silence except for wind whistling through wires and the sound of his own breathing. He was 3 miles behind German lines. No power, a dying aircraft, 2 choices. Turn back and hope to glide to British territory, or bail out over enemy lines and spend the rest of the war in a prison camp. Eddie chose to glide. B-3782 had carried him through 13 months, through dozens of missions, through training and combat and modifications and repairs. The old Camel had earned loyalty. He trimmed for best glide speed, 80 miles per hour, descent rate 200 feet per minute. The math was simple and brutal. He had 800 feet and needed to cover 3 miles. It wasn't enough. The Camel glided silently. No engine noise, just wind. Eddie scanned ahead looking for anywhere to put down. The landscape was a nightmare. Shell craters, mud, wire, destroyed buildings, there. A field, rough but relatively flat, half a mile behind British lines. If he could stretch the glide that far. The Camel was sinking. 500 feet, 400. The field was ahead but too far. Eddie nosed down slightly, trading altitude for distance. The sink rate increased. 300 feet, 200. The field was close. So close. But the Camel was dropping fast. 100 feet, 50. Eddie crossed into British-held territory at 20 feet altitude, the Camel barely flying on the edge of stall. The field was ahead, rough ground, shell holes. But it was ground and it was British ground, and it would have to do. He flared at 10 feet. The Camel touched down hard. The left wheel hit a shell crater. The aircraft slewed sideways. The wing caught the ground. The Camel flipped, rolling, tearing itself apart. Eddie's world became chaos. Metal screaming, canvas tearing, the smell of gasoline, his body thrown against straps. Pain, then stillness. Eddie hung upside down in his straps. Fuel was leaking, dripping past his face. He could smell it, could hear it pooling below. One spark and he'd burn. His hands moved, released the belt. He fell onto his shoulders, onto the torn canvas above him, now below him. Crawled out of the wreckage on hands and knees. Got 10 feet away before his legs gave out. British soldiers appeared, shouting, running. They pulled him further from the wreckage, checked for injuries. Eddie's ribs screamed with pain. His head throbbed. Burns on his hands from touching hot metal. But he was alive. He turned to look at B-3782. The Camel was destroyed. Wings torn off, fuselage broken. The faithful aircraft that had kept him alive through so much was now wreckage, scattered across a French field. "Sorry, old girl," Eddie whispered. "You deserve better." One of the soldiers helped him to his feet. "Can you walk, sir?" "I think so. We need to move. Jerry Artillery has this area ranged." As if to punctuate the point, a shell landed 200 yards away. Eddie let the soldiers half carry him toward the rear lines. Behind him, more shells fell. One landed near the wrecked Camel. The fuel caught. Fire bloomed orange and black. Eddie watched his aircraft burn, watched 13 months of his life consumed by flames. He was evacuated to a field hospital. 3 broken ribs, concussion, second-degree burns on both hands. The doctor said he was lucky, said he'd recover fully, said the war would probably be over before he was fit to fly again. Eddie lay in a hospital bed, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to distant artillery. He thought about Oliver, about Artie, about the students he'd trained, about all the pilots who hadn't made it home. He thought about 3 choices: Wooden Cross, Red Cross, Victoria Cross. He'd chosen the Red Cross. Injury instead of death. Survival instead of glory. It was enough. November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. The guns stopped. After 4 years. After millions of dead. After trench warfare and gas attacks and artillery barrages that turned farmland into moonscape. The guns stopped. Eddie heard it in the hospital. The sudden silence. No distant rumble. No background thunder that had been constant for so long, you stopped hearing it until it was gone. Men wept, some from relief, some from grief for friends who hadn't lived to see this day, some from the sheer, overwhelming enormity of survival. Eddie sat on his hospital bed, ribs still taped, hands still bandaged. He felt numb, disconnected. The war was over, and he didn't know how to process it. He had killed 12 men, confirmed, probably more, had seen friends die, had taught young pilots and watched some of them die anyway, had spent 13 months in a state of constant stress where death was always one mistake away. And now it was over. Just like that. No ceremony, no grand finale, just silence where there had been noise. A nurse brought news that filtered through the hospital. Germany had surrendered. Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated. The armistice terms were being finalized. Soldiers would begin going home. Home. Eddie hadn't seen Manchester in over 2 years, hadn't seen his father, hadn't slept in his own bed or walked familiar streets or done any of the thousand small things that made up normal life. He didn't know if he could go back, didn't know if the person he'd been still existed inside the person he'd become. In December, Eddie was released from the hospital. In January, he returned to England. The official casualty reports were still being compiled, but the numbers were staggering. Over 9 million military deaths, 20 million wounded, civilian casualties beyond counting. The Royal Flying Corps had suffered particularly brutal losses. Of the pilots who had served in France, fewer than half survived. Some squadrons had complete turnover every 6 weeks. The average life expectancy for pilots remained horrifyingly low throughout the war. But Eddie Hartley had survived. 12 victories, 13 months of combat, 27 combat missions, over 200 flight hours in Sopwith Camels. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. The citation mentioned gallantry and devotion to duty. It didn't mention the nightmares, the shaking hands, the sudden panic at loud noises. 1920. The Royal Air Force, formed from the merger of the RFC and Royal Naval Air Service, officially retired the Sopwith Camel. Newer designs had surpassed it. Technology moved on. The revolutionary fighter of 1917 was obsolete by 1920. Eddie attended a ceremony at the new RAF Museum where a camel was being put on display. Not his B-3782, which had burned in France, but another, Camel B-6313, William Barker's aircraft, the highest-scoring Sopwith Camel of the war. 46 confirmed victories. Eddie stood before the aircraft with a young boy beside him. The boy was maybe 10 years old, eyes wide with wonder. "Mister, did you really fly these?" Eddie nodded. "For 13 months. Were you scared?" The question cut through years and defense mechanisms and carefully constructed walls. Eddie knelt down to the boy's level. Terrified. Every single time. "But you flew anyway." "Yes." Why? Eddie thought about how to explain it. About duty and honor and necessity. About friends who needed protection and enemies who needed stopping. About the simple, brutal calculus of war. But what came out was simpler, more honest. Because someone had to. Because other men were depending on me. Because the fear of letting them down was stronger than the fear of dying. The boy considered this. "My dad was in the war. He doesn't talk about it much." "That's common. Some things are hard to talk about." "He has nightmares." Eddie nodded slowly. "A lot of us do." The boy looked at the camel. "Was it a good airplane?" "It was an honest airplane. It didn't lie to you. If you made a mistake, it told you immediately. No second chances, no forgiveness. But if you learned to work with it, if you understood its nature and respected its power, it would do things other aircraft couldn't." Eddie placed a hand on the camel's wing. The fabric was taut under his palm, varnished smooth. This museum piece was pristine in a way combat aircraft never were. No bullet holes, no oil stains, no patches covering damage. "We didn't conquer the camel," Eddie said quietly, more to himself than the boy. "We learned to dance with it." The ones who survived understood that. The ones who tried to force it, to master it through strength instead of understanding, they're the ones who got wooden crosses. The boy's mother called him away. Eddie stayed alone with the aircraft and his memories. 1,294 confirmed victories. That was the Camel's official tally, more than any Allied fighter in World War I. But the cost was written in training accidents, in combat losses, in pilots who never got the chance to learn its secrets. Eddie thought about Oliver, about the 18 pilots lost in training before dual controls became standard, about Danny Wright explaining physics and gyroscopes, about Artie teaching intuition, about passing that knowledge forward to students who passed it to others. The legacy wasn't just victory tallies, it was understanding, preparation, knowledge that saved lives. Eddie left the museum as afternoon light painted London gold. He walked streets he had walked before the war, but everything felt different. Or maybe he was different, and the streets hadn't changed at all. A veteran passed him on the sidewalk. Neither spoke, but their eyes met. Recognition, understanding. The silent acknowledgement of men who had seen things they couldn't explain to people who hadn't been there. That night, Eddie wrote in his journal, He'd kept it sporadically during the war, more frequently after, working through memories, processing trauma, finding meaning. He wrote, "The camel gave us three choices: death, injury, or glory. But there was a fourth choice hidden inside those three: understanding, the choice to study instead of assuming, to respect instead of conquering, to work with the machine instead of fighting it. That choice saved my life. I'll spend the rest of my days trying to pass it forward, to teach what I learned, to honor the ones who didn't make it by helping others survive what they couldn't. The war is over. The camel is retired, but the lessons remain. Face your fear, understand your tools, respect forces greater than yourself. And above all, remember that courage isn't the absence of terror. It's functioning anyway, flying anyway, living anyway. That's all any of us did. That's all any of us could do. We learned to dance with death. Some of us survived the dance. And those of us who did carry the responsibility to make that survival mean something." Eddie closed the journal. Outside his window, London continued its slow recovery from war. Buildings being repaired, soldiers coming home, life resuming. But for men like Eddie Hartley, the war would never truly end. It would live in nightmares and sudden panics, in the weight of memories, in the faces of friends who didn't come home, in the sound of aircraft engines that still made his heart race. He had survived the wooden cross, had earned the Red Cross with his injuries, had received medals, if not the Victoria Cross. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. He had learned, he had taught, he had passed knowledge forward, and somewhere in some future war with some future machine, that knowledge might save another terrified young pilot. It wasn't glory, but it was legacy. And for Edward Hartley, that was enough.